Imagine yourself in a moment of deep pain and uncertainty, where everything seems lost. Have you ever felt that way? Often, circumstances make us question our paths, but it is precisely in these moments that loyalty and love can transform our lives in unexpected ways. The story of Ruth, a Moabite who chose to stay by her mother-in-law Naomi's side amid pain and grief, teaches us about the strength of commitment and faithfulness. Even in a foreign land, Ruth found a new purpose and was greatly rewarded, becoming the ancestor of Jesus himself. Through loyalty and family love, she shows us that faithfulness, even in the hardest times, always finds its reward. Are you ready to discover how this story can transform your life? ***. In a distant time, in the land of Bethlehem of Judah, the people faced a period of deep anguish and uncertainty. The scorching sun punished the land, and the rain that once brought life and hope had disappeared, leaving the fields dry and the rivers too weak to flow. The crops, which once ensured the sustenance of families, had become a distant dream. There was no more wheat in the barns, nor barley for the animals. Famine began to strike the homes, and despair spread like a shadow over the hearts of the people. Amid this desolate scene lived a man named Elimelech. He was a man of faith and principles, known for his wisdom and for leading his family with love and devotion. Elimelech, along with his wife Naomi, a strong woman with a big heart, lived a simple life but one full of gratitude to God. They had 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, young men who brought joy and pride to their parents. However, even with all the faith and hope that Elimelech and his family placed in God, the famine showed no signs of relenting. Each day became more difficult, and the empty shelves at home served as a painful reminder of the gravity of the situation. The laughter of children in the streets was replaced by the silent crying of mothers who had nothing to give their children. The situation in Bethlehem had become unsustainable. Elimelech knew he had to make a difficult decision to save his family. He spent nights in prayer, asking God for guidance, seeking a way out of that torment. His heart was torn, for he loved his land, the place where his ancestors had lived and where he had built his life. But his love for his family was greater, and he could no longer bear to see the suffering in the eyes of his wife and children. It was then that, after much reflection and prayer, Elimelech made a decision that would change the fate of his family. He decided to leave Bethlehem, to leave behind everything he knew, and seek refuge in a foreign land, Moab. Moab was a distant land, inhabited by a different people, with distinct customs and beliefs. However, Elimelech believed that in that land, there would be a chance of survival to find the sustenance his family so desperately needed. Naomi, always by her husband's side, understood the gravity of the situation and supported Elimelech's decision, though her heart was heavy with sadness for leaving her homeland. Together, they prepared Mahlon and Chilion for the long journey that awaited them. It would not be an easy journey. The path was long and full of challenges, but the hope for a better future motivated them to move forward. As they said goodbye to Bethlehem, Elimelech looked back one last time, gazing at the hills and fields that had once been green and fertile. He knew he was leaving without any guarantee of return, but he carried the faith that God would guide and protect them at every step of the journey. So, with courage and determination, Elimelech, Naomi, Mahlon, and Chilion left the land of Bethlehem and set out for Moab, a land unknown to them but one that promised a new beginning. After the long and exhausting journey, Elimelech, Naomi, and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, finally arrived in the land of Moab. The journey had not been easy. The roads were arduous, and discouragement sometimes weighed on their shoulders. But when they saw Moab, a land full of new promises, a breath of renewed hope filled their hearts. The contrast between the drought in Bethlehem and the fertile land of Moab was evident. The green hills and fields filled with grain brought immediate relief to the souls of that exhausted and hungry family. In Moab, they found a new home and began to rebuild their lives. Despite the cultural and religious differences between the Israelites and the Moabites, Elimelech and his family were well received. They soon found a place to settle and began working to secure the necessary sustenance. Naomi, with her skill and wisdom, took care of the household, while Elimelech and his sons helped with the harvest and daily tasks. However, the tranquility that the family had achieved was abruptly interrupted by an unexpected tragedy. Elimelech, the foundation of that family, fell gravely ill and, in a short time, passed away. The pain of the loss was overwhelming for Naomi. She, who had already left her homeland and faced so many difficulties, now found herself alone in a foreign land, without her husband by her side. Naomi clung to her faith, but the void left by Elimelech was deep and painful. Despite the pain, life continued, and Naomi found solace in the presence of her sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Now, as young adults, they decided it was time to start their own families. Moab was a new land for them, and there they met two Moabite women who would change the course of their lives, Ruth and Orpah. Both were women of great character and kindness, and they soon won the hearts of the young men. Over time, Mahlon married Ruth, and Chilion married Orpah, bringing a new light to Naomi's household. Naomi, though still mourning the loss of Elimelech, found some joy in her new daughters-in-law, who treated her with respect and love. The house was once again full of life, and the hope for better days began to bloom once more. Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah formed a strong bond, sharing stories, traditions, and cultivating a harmonious life together. However, fate had more challenges in store for Naomi. Mahlon and Chilion, who had breathed new life into her, also fell ill. What began as a simple illness quickly turned into something much more serious. Naomi did everything in her power to care for her sons, but just like their father, Mahlon and Chilion did not survive and passed away, leaving Naomi devastated and adrift. Now, Naomi found herself in an even more painful situation than before. Not only had she lost her husband, but also her two sons, who were her last connection to Elimelech. In Moab, a land where she had sought refuge and security, she now found herself alone, without her husband and without her sons, surrounded only by memories and the deep pain of loss. Naomi was desolate. Her soul was broken, and her heart was crushed by sorrow. She looked around and saw what was left of her family. Her two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. They too were grieving, mourning the loss of their husbands, but even in the midst of their own pain, they remained by Naomi's side, trying in some way to lighten the burden she carried. Naomi felt empty, as if all the joy had been stripped from her life. She began to think that perhaps God had forgotten her, that all her prayers and hopes had fallen on deaf ears. Bitterness began to take hold of her heart, and she started to question if there was any purpose in her survival. Yet, despite the darkness surrounding Naomi, a small flame of hope still flickered. The words of Elimelech, the love of her sons, and the care of Ruth and Orpah kept this flame alive, albeit faintly. In that moment of great pain, Naomi did not yet know that this small flame of hope would become a new beginning, a story of redemption that would change the course of their lives and echo through the ages. Naomi's journey was far from over, and even in the midst of so much pain, God was preparing something extraordinary for her. Give a like if you are enjoying this incredible story of Naomi and Ruth. One day, as Naomi sat lost in her thoughts, she heard a rumor that swept through the lands of Moab like a gentle and promising breeze. It was news that seemed too good to be true. The Lord had looked upon his people in Bethlehem and blessed the land once again with bread. The rains had returned, the harvests were abundant, and the people of Israel, who had suffered so much, were now rejoicing in the abundance. Naomi felt something stir within her. The heart that had been heavy and bitter began to beat with new hope. The idea of returning to her homeland, of seeing the hills of Bethlehem again, where her life had begun, brought her a sense of peace that she had not felt in a long time. She knew that the decision to go to Moab had been the right one at the time, but now it was time to go back home. Bethlehem was calling her, and Naomi felt that there she would find the comfort she so desperately needed. However, Naomi was not alone. Ruth and Orpah, her daughters-in-law, were by her side, sharing in her pain and being her support during the most difficult moments. Naomi, despite loving them deeply, knew that the journey back to Bethlehem would be long and full of uncertainties. She also knew that in Moab, Ruth and Orpah still had a chance to rebuild their lives. They were young, had their families, and could remarry, build a new life, while Naomi, in her old age, expected nothing more than a peaceful end. With a heavy heart, Naomi called Ruth and Orpah for a conversation. She needed to be honest with them, no matter how much it might cause her pain. With a soft but firm voice, Naomi explained her decision to return to Bethlehem. She told them about the blessing the Lord had poured out on his people and about her desire to return to her homeland, where her soul might find rest. Naomi then looked deeply into her daughters-in-law's eyes, and with tears threatening to fall, she encouraged them to stay in Moab. "My daughters," she said, with a voice choked with emotion, "you have been a great blessing to me, and I am eternally grateful for everything you have done. But now it is time for you to move on. Stay in Moab, where you have your families, where you can find new husbands and have children. You don't need to carry the weight of my suffering. I am old, and there is no more hope for me. But you still have your whole lives ahead of you." Ruth and Orpah, upon hearing Naomi's words, were deeply moved. They couldn't imagine their lives without Naomi, who had become a second mother to them. The three embraced, and the tears that had been held back now flowed freely, a mix of pain, love, and fear of what the future held. Orpah, though reluctant, realized that Naomi was right. With a heavy heart, she decided to follow her mother-in-law's advice. She kissed Naomi and Ruth, bidding them farewell with promises that she would always remember them and love them forever. With one last look, Orpah walked away, returning to her family in Moab, where she hoped to find a new beginning. Ruth, however, felt something different in her heart. Despite Naomi's words and the logic of her decision, she couldn't imagine leaving her mother-in-law. Something inside her told her that she should move forward, not with Orpah, but with Naomi. She knew that the journey would be difficult, that the road to Bethlehem was filled with uncertainties, but her loyalty and love for Naomi were stronger than any fear or doubt. The sun was setting on the horizon, casting a soft, golden glow over the hills of Moab. The road ahead of Naomi and Ruth was long, and each step seemed heavier with the emotional burden they carried. The silence between the two women was broken only by the sound of their feet on the dry ground and the memories that surfaced with each thought. Naomi, still recovering from Orpah's departure, looked at Ruth. She knew that this young woman had the right to rebuild her life in Moab, surrounded by her family and traditions. Naomi didn't want Ruth to carry the weight of her sadness and loneliness. After all, she had already lost so much and didn't want to be the cause of more suffering. It was then that Naomi stopped walking, took a deep breath, and turned to Ruth, intending once more to convince her to stay. "My daughter," Naomi began, her voice trembling with emotion, "it is no longer time to follow me. I have nothing left to offer. Return to your mother's house, where you can find comfort and security. I am an old and bitter woman, and I don't want you, so young and full of life, to follow a path of suffering by my side. Return, Ruth, and may the Lord bless you for all the kindness you have shown me." Ruth, hearing these words, felt her heart tighten. She loved Naomi as a mother, a friend, and felt a deep connection that couldn't be explained in words. The thought of leaving Naomi alone in such a cruel world was unimaginable for Ruth. She knew that her place was not in Moab, but by Naomi's side, wherever this journey might take them. With a firmness that even surprised herself, Ruth approached Naomi, took her hands, and looked directly into her eyes. There, in that moment of pain and uncertainty, Ruth felt an unshakable courage rise within her, and with a voice full of conviction, she declared, "Do not urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go I will go, and where you stay I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God my God. Where you die I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." These words, so powerful and full of meaning, echoed in Naomi's heart like balm on an open wound. She felt tears fill her eyes, not from sadness, but from deep gratitude and relief. In that moment, Naomi realized that even amid the tragedy, God had given her an invaluable gift: Ruth's unconditional loyalty. Ruth's declaration was not just a promise of companionship. It was a lifelong commitment, a deliberate choice to abandon everything she knew, her land, her culture, her gods, to follow Naomi and adopt the God of Israel as her own. This decision was laden with meaning, as it meant that Ruth was giving up the security of her previous life to embrace an unknown future, all out of love for Naomi and faith in a God she barely knew, but was willing to serve. Naomi, touched by this demonstration of love and loyalty, no longer had the strength to insist. She knew that Ruth was determined and that this decision had not been made lightly. Naomi embraced Ruth tightly, and in that embrace, they shared a silent understanding that, regardless of what the future held for them, they would face it together. With this new resolve, the two women continued their journey toward Bethlehem. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Ruth's declaration had given them both a new strength. They were no longer alone. They were united by a bond stronger than any adversity they might encounter. Ruth was not only committed to Naomi, but also to a God who would guide their steps back to Bethlehem, where a new chapter of their lives would begin. After days of walking, Naomi and Ruth finally saw the familiar hills of Bethlehem. The journey had been long and exhausting, marked by painful memories and uncertainties about the future. Each step taken along the dusty roads brought back memories of a past that Naomi preferred to forget, but which followed her like a shadow. Ruth, by her side, not only shared the physical fatigue, but also the emotional burden that Naomi carried. As they approached the city, the first lights of dusk began to shine. The air was filled with the scent of freshly plowed earth and the gentle breeze coming from the fields. It was the beginning of the barley harvest, a time of hard work but also of great expectation for the farmers of the region. The fields around Bethlehem were full of life, a stark contrast to the pain and emptiness Naomi felt in her heart. As they neared the city gates, the news of Naomi's return quickly spread. Bethlehem was a small town where everyone knew each other, and Naomi's return, after so many years, was something no one expected. The women of the city, busy with their daily tasks, soon left what they were doing to see for themselves if it was true that Naomi had come back. The first to spot her were the women working by the roadside. They stopped and began to whisper among themselves, surprised and confused. The woman now walking toward the city was not the same one they remembered. The Naomi who had left Bethlehem years ago was a woman full of life, with a family by her side and hope for the future. But the woman returning now seemed like a shadow of her former self. Her shoulders bent under the weight of sorrow, her face marked by suffering, her eyes lacking the brightness they once had. "Is this really Naomi?" the women asked each other, shocked by the transformation they saw before them. The news spread quickly, and soon a small group of townspeople gathered to welcome the woman who had once known joy and prosperity, but now seemed burdened with deep sadness. Naomi, noticing the murmurs of the people around her and feeling the looks filled with pity and surprise, felt a tightening in her heart. She knew what everyone was thinking. She could see the compassion mixed with curiosity in the eyes of the people surrounding her. Unable to contain the pain that consumed her any longer, Naomi raised her head and, with a voice choked with emotion, said, "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter." Those words, spoken with such intensity, resonated with those present. Mara, which means bitter, was now the name Naomi chose for herself, for she believed that her life had been transformed by pain and loss. She continued, with tears threatening to fall from her eyes, "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has brought calamity upon me and the Almighty has afflicted me?" The group around Naomi remained silent, understanding the depth of her pain. Naomi's words revealed the story of a woman who, in her absence, had lost everything: husband, sons, and any hope of a happy life. Now, she was returning to her hometown, but not as the vibrant woman she once was, rather as someone who had been broken by circumstances. Ruth, who had been by Naomi's side the entire time, observed in silence. She understood her mother-in-law's pain, but also knew that this arrival in Bethlehem marked the beginning of something new. Ruth, with her youth and determination, was ready to face the challenges that lay ahead. She was beside Naomi not just as a companion, but as an adopted daughter, willing to do whatever it took to bring a little light back into Naomi's life. As the women of Bethlehem processed what they had just heard, Ruth, with a determined and purposeful look, supported Naomi and helped her continue the journey into the city. Their journey was not yet complete. In fact, it was only just beginning. Naomi, who now saw herself as Mara, carried the bitterness of loss, but by her side was someone who, with love and loyalty, was determined to bring back hope and redemption to their lives. And so, Naomi and Ruth entered Bethlehem, a city that would become the setting for one of the most beautiful stories of love, redemption, and faithfulness the world has ever known. What Naomi could not foresee in that moment of pain was that God still had plans for her. Plans that would turn her bitterness into joy and her suffering into countless blessings. With their return to Bethlehem, Naomi and Ruth faced a new challenge: how to survive in a land that, while familiar to Naomi, now seemed so distant from everything they had known. Hunger and poverty were harsh realities, especially for two women alone. Naomi, still immersed in her sadness and bitterness, felt powerless to provide for them both. But Ruth, with her youth and determination, did not let herself be disheartened. She knew she needed to take action to ensure their sustenance. It was then that one day, Ruth decided to take a courageous step. She stood up and gently approached Naomi, saying, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Ruth knew that during the harvest, the workers often left behind some stalks, which poor women and foreigners had the right to gather. It was a humble and tiring task, but Ruth was willing to do whatever was necessary to feed herself and her dear mother-in-law. Naomi, touched by Ruth's courage and determination, gave her permission with a slight nod. "Go, my daughter," she said, her voice trembling. Naomi knew that working in the field would be hard, but she also knew that Ruth possessed extraordinary inner strength, a strength that, in many ways, sustained Naomi herself. Ruth then headed to the fields outside Bethlehem, where the workers were already harvesting barley. The sun was high in the sky, and the heat was beginning to intensify, but Ruth, with the humility and perseverance that characterized her, began to gather the fallen stalks. She walked from one side to the other, carefully picking up each grain she found, grateful for every small provision. As Ruth worked, the workers watched her with curiosity. It was rare to see a young foreign woman, so dedicated and tireless, working so diligently among the stalks. But Ruth did not let herself be distracted. Her mind was focused on the task at hand, and her heart was at peace knowing that she was doing her best to care for Naomi. It was during this work that Ruth, unknowingly, entered the fields belonging to Boaz, a prominent man in Bethlehem. Boaz was a distant relative of Elimelech, Naomi's late husband, and a man known for his kindness, wisdom, and wealth. That day, Boaz went to the fields to check on the progress of the harvest and greet his workers, as was his custom. He walked among the bundles of barley, observing the hard work of his servants when his eyes fell on Ruth. Curious about the identity of the young woman, Boaz called one of his foremen and asked, "Whose young woman is this?" The foreman, well aware of Naomi and Ruth's story, replied, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the land of Moab. She asked to gather grain among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She has been working steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest." Boaz, hearing this, was impressed by Ruth's dedication and courage. He knew that she was the foreigner who had left everything to accompany Naomi and serve the God of Israel. With a heart full of compassion and respect, Boaz approached Ruth. He spoke to her in a gentle and welcoming tone, saying, "Listen, my daughter, don't go and glean in another field and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." Ruth, surprised and touched by Boaz's generosity, bowed down before him in respect and asked, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied with a serene smile, I have been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law Naomi since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Boaz's words deeply touched Ruth's heart. She felt a wave of gratitude wash over her and responded with humility. "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord. You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls." From that day on, Ruth's life began to change. Boaz ordered his servants to let some stalks fall deliberately so that Ruth could gather them easily. He ensured that she was protected and well cared for while she was in his fields. Ruth, in her humility and gratitude, continued to work hard, and at the end of the day, she would return to Naomi with the fruits of her labor, a sustenance that, for them, was like manna from heaven. As the days passed, Boaz's kindness toward Ruth and Naomi did not go unnoticed. Naomi began to realize that God's hand was in everything that was happening. What Naomi and Ruth did not know, however, was that the simple act of gathering grain in Boaz's fields would be the beginning of a story of redemption and restoration that God had planned for their lives. The sun rose high in the sky, marking midday in the barley fields of Bethlehem. Boaz's workers had already spent hours under the heat, harvesting and tying the bundles, their calloused hands moving with the skill of those accustomed to hard work. Among them, Ruth, the young Moabite, continued her task with a determination that did not go unnoticed. Boaz, who had already learned about Ruth and the story behind her arrival in Bethlehem, watched the young woman working from a distance. His heart, already touched by Ruth's loyalty and courage, was further moved as he saw her gathering stalks with such diligence, despite the heat and fatigue. He knew that Ruth was not just working for herself. She was doing it for Naomi, her mother-in-law, whom she had vowed to protect and care for. Determined to show even more consideration, Boaz made a decision that would demonstrate just how much he valued Ruth. When mealtime arrived, he approached her with a welcoming gesture. "Come over here," he said with a gentle smile. "Have some bread and dip it in the vinegar." Ruth, surprised and honored by the invitation, humbly accepted. She sat down beside Boaz's workers, a position she could never have imagined occupying, being a foreigner and, moreover, a widow without possessions. Boaz personally served her, offering her roasted grain. Ruth ate until she was satisfied, something that hadn't happened in a long time, ever since hardships had fallen upon her and Naomi. Boaz's kindness didn't stop there. He wanted to ensure that Ruth not only had a decent meal at that moment, but that she and Naomi would be sustained for a longer period. With a discreet but clear instruction, Boaz called his workers and said, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." Boaz's workers, accustomed to following his orders, immediately agreed. They understood that Boaz was acting with compassion and respect for Ruth and did not question his instructions. Thus, throughout the remainder of the day, Ruth was able to gather among the sheaves, picking up stalks that would otherwise have been out of her reach. With each handful she gathered, Ruth felt the weight of Boaz's generosity upon her, a generosity that transcended the simple act of providing food. It was a care that revealed a noble and godly character. When the day came to an end, Ruth, with her sack full of grain, prepared to return home. She could hardly believe the amount of barley she had managed to gather. It was far more than she had expected, a generous provision that would sustain them for several days. As she lifted the sack of grain onto her shoulders, Ruth felt God's blessing on her life and on Naomi's, manifested through Boaz's kindness. ***. When she arrived home, Naomi was anxiously waiting for her. When she saw the amount of grain Ruth had brought, her eyes filled with amazement and joy. "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you," Naomi exclaimed, unable to contain her surprise. With a smile, Ruth recounted to Naomi everything that had happened that day, including Boaz's kindness and how he had offered her water, food, and ensured that she could glean among the sheaves. Naomi, upon hearing Boaz's name, realized something that Ruth did not yet know. Boaz was a close relative, a kinsman redeemer, someone who could play an important role in restoring their lives. This man, Naomi began, her voice laden with emotion, is our close relative. He is one of our redeemers. These words echoed in the small house, heavy with significance. For Ruth, who did not yet fully understand the culture and laws of Israel, Naomi explained with patience and enthusiasm. In Israel, there was a sacred tradition that family members had the responsibility to care for one another in times of need. A kinsman redeemer, or goel, as it was called in Hebrew, was someone who had the duty to rescue family members in times of crisis, especially in the case of widows and orphans. The redeemer could buy back land that the family had lost, marry the widow to continue the family name, and ensure that the lineage did not die out. Naomi, realizing that Boaz was one of these redeemers, saw the hand of God working powerfully and mysteriously in their lives. She, who had until then been consumed by bitterness and grief, felt a new hope springing in her heart. God had not abandoned them. Even amid suffering and loss, he was weaving a story of redemption, and Boaz was the key to that. Blessed be he by the Lord, who has not stopped showing kindness to the living and the dead, Naomi exclaimed, her eyes shining with renewed fervor. She saw God's plan unfolding before her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the darkness surrounding her life beginning to lift. Ruth, hearing Naomi's words, understood the depth of what was happening. She had not only found favor in the eyes of a generous man, she had been guided by God to that field, to Boaz, who now could be the instrument of divine providence in their lives. Naomi, full of hope, began to think about the possibilities that were opening up before them. She knew that she needed to be wise and careful, but she also recognized that it was time to act. Boaz was not just a relative. He was a righteous, godly man of noble character. He could be the redeemer who would bring about the restoration that Naomi and Ruth so desperately needed. With this new understanding, Naomi shared with Ruth her vision of what the future might hold. "My daughter," she said with renewed confidence, "stay close to Boaz's servant girls and continue gleaning in his fields. Don't go to another field, for you will be safe under his protection. Let's trust that the Lord will guide us in what needs to be done." And so, Naomi's recognition of divine providence not only transformed her perspective, but also paved a new path for her and Ruth's lives. What once seemed to be a bleak future was now illuminated by the hope of redemption, by the possibility of a new beginning. Weeks passed, and the harvest in Boaz's fields continued, filling the barns with barley and bringing sustenance to Naomi and Ruth. Boaz's generosity had ensured that the two women not only survived but also began to feel that God's hand was guiding them toward a future of hope. Naomi, however, knew that something more needed to be done. She recognized divine providence, but she also knew that it was time to act with wisdom. One night, as they sat together in the humble home they now called their own, Naomi turned to Ruth with a thoughtful look. The light in her eyes indicated that she was about to share something important. Ruth, always attentive to her mother-in-law's words, waited with anticipation. "My daughter," Naomi began, her voice filled with affection and concern, "shouldn't I seek a secure home for you, where you can be well cared for and live in peace? You have been so faithful and dedicated, and it is only right that you find rest and security for your future." Ruth, touched by Naomi's concern, nodded, though she did not fully understand what her mother-in-law was suggesting. Then, with growing determination in her voice, Naomi continued, "Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been working, is our close relative. He is one of our redeemers, the one who can redeem us and restore the dignity of our family. Tonight, he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. I have a plan, my daughter, and I need you to trust me." Ruth looked at Naomi, her unwavering trust in her mother-in-law evident in her eyes. "Tell me what I should do," Ruth responded, ready to follow Naomi's instructions, even though she did not yet fully understand what it all meant. Naomi then began to explain her plan in detail. "First, I want you to wash and anoint yourself with oil so that you will be clean and fragrant. Then put on your best clothes. Go down to the threshing floor, but do not let Boaz know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking and is in good spirits. When he lies down to rest, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." Ruth, upon hearing these instructions, was surprised. Naomi's plan was bold and filled with cultural significance. Naomi was instructing Ruth to approach Boaz in a manner that was both humble and symbolic. By lying at Boaz's feet and covering them, Ruth would be respectfully asking him to take her under his protection as her redeemer. This act, though simple, was laden with implications. Boaz, as a just and godly man, would immediately understand what Ruth was asking, that he fulfill the role of redeemer, offering her and Naomi not only protection but also the opportunity for redemption and restoration within the community of Israel. Ruth, always loyal and obedient, looked at Naomi with gratitude. "I will do everything you say," she replied, her voice filled with determination. Ruth fully trusted Naomi's judgment and knew that her mother-in-law was acting with wisdom and discernment, guided by God. That evening, as dusk fell over the threshing floor, Ruth prepared herself according to Naomi's instructions. She washed, anointed herself with fragrant oil, and dressed in her best clothes. Each gesture was performed with care, reflecting both the humility and respect she had for Boaz and for the mission she was about to undertake. Upon arriving at the threshing floor, Ruth kept her distance, observing Boaz as he worked, ate, and drank with his servants, celebrating the completion of another day of harvest. When Boaz finally retired to rest, lying down in a corner of the threshing floor, Ruth patiently waited until he fell asleep. With her heart pounding but her mind resolute, Ruth approached Boaz. Silently, she knelt down and reverently uncovered his feet, lying down at his feet as Naomi had instructed. It was an act of humility and submission, but also one of great courage and faith. As Ruth waited in silence, enveloped by the darkness of the night, Naomi's plan began to unfold. What seemed like a simple act of humility was, in fact, a profound request for redemption and protection. A request that would not only impact Ruth's future but also Naomi's and eventually the entire lineage of Israel. Divine providence, recognized by Naomi, was at work. Her plan, guided by wisdom and faith, had placed Ruth on the path to Boaz, a path that God had precisely traced. And so, in that silence, under the starry sky, the story of Ruth and Boaz was about to take a new step, full of hope and promises. Time seemed to stretch in that nighttime stillness. Ruth, lying there, knew that this moment was crucial. The moon softly illuminated the scene as a gentle wind swayed the barley stalks around her. Then, in the middle of the night, Boaz stirred, waking from his sleep. As he noticed something at his feet, he turned suddenly and, to his surprise, saw a woman lying there. "Who are you?" Boaz asked, his voice low and full of astonishment but also concern. In his eyes was the confusion of someone awakened from a dream, mixed with curiosity about what was happening. Ruth, with her heart racing, lifted her head and responded in a soft but firm voice, "I am your servant Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over your servant, for you are a redeemer." These words, spoken with all humility and hope, resonated deeply in Boaz's heart. By asking him to spread his garment over her, Ruth was not merely asking for shelter. She was asking him to fulfill his role as a redeemer, to take responsibility for caring for her and Naomi, and to secure the future of their family. Boaz, upon hearing Ruth's request, immediately understood its significance. He not only recognized the courage Ruth showed in making such a request, but also the honor and loyalty she demonstrated toward Naomi and the family of Elimelech. A feeling of admiration and respect for Ruth grew within him. "May the Lord bless you, my daughter," Boaz said, his voice now filled with tenderness and admiration. "You have shown even greater kindness now than before, by not going after younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." Boaz knew that Ruth was a woman of noble character, and her decision to place herself under his protection was not driven by personal interests, but by a deep sense of duty and loyalty. He also knew there was a matter that needed to be resolved. There was another relative, closer than he, who had the first right to redeem Naomi's family. But Boaz, determined to act with integrity, promised Ruth that he would settle the matter in the morning. "Stay here tonight," Boaz continued, "and in the morning we will see what happens. If he wants to redeem you, very well. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it." With these words, Boaz assured Ruth that she and Naomi would be protected, no matter what happened. He was ready to take Ruth as his wife and redeem Elimelech's family, if that was God's will. Ruth remained at Boaz's feet until morning, but before dawn fully broke, Boaz gently woke her, asking her to return home discreetly so that no one would know a woman had been at the threshing floor. Before she left, Boaz filled her shawl with a large amount of barley, a generous provision that symbolized the care he was beginning to show for her and Naomi. Ruth, with a heart full of gratitude and renewed hope, returned home carrying Boaz's gift. When she arrived, Naomi was waiting anxiously, eager to know how the meeting had gone. When Ruth recounted everything that had happened, Naomi smiled with satisfaction. She clearly saw God's hand guiding each step of the plan. "Now, my daughter," Naomi said, "wait to see what happens. Boaz will not rest until he has settled the matter today." And so, as the day began to dawn over Bethlehem, Ruth and Naomi waited with hearts full of hope. They knew their fate was in God's hands, and that, regardless of who the Redeemer would be, divine providence was guiding each step. Boaz, for his part, left the threshing floor with determination. He was resolved to handle the matter in the most just and honorable way possible. Ruth's courage and virtue had deeply touched his heart, and he was ready to do whatever was necessary to ensure that she and Naomi were redeemed and cared for. The commitment Boaz made that night at the threshing floor was not only to Ruth but also to God, in whom he trusted to guide every decision. Boaz wanted to ensure that Ruth and Naomi were protected and that Elimelech's lineage was preserved. Boaz made his way to the city gate, the place where legal matters were handled and where the elders gathered to judge and witness important transactions. The city gate was more than just an entrance. It was the center of community life, where decisions that shaped the future of the city were made. Upon arriving, Boaz sat on one of the stone benches and waited for the nearest relative, the one who had the first right to redeem Elimelech's land and take Ruth as his wife. It wasn't long before this man passed by the gate, and Boaz, always direct, called out to him. "Come over here, my friend, and sit down," Boaz said, calling him by name and indicating a place beside him. The man, curious about what Boaz wanted to discuss, promptly accepted the invitation. Boaz, understanding the traditions and the importance of formalizing the process, summoned 10 of the city's elders to join them as witnesses. Once everyone was gathered, Boaz began to present the matter clearly. "You are aware that Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech," Boaz began, looking directly at the man in front of him. "I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these elders and the people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am next in line." The relative, upon hearing the offer, pondered for a moment. Acquiring Elimelech's land seemed like a good deal, something that would increase his possessions and benefit his family. He quickly responded, "I will redeem it." But Boaz, knowing all the details of the law and being a man of justice, mentioned the crucial point the relative needed to consider. "On the day you buy the land from Naomi," Boaz continued, "you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the deceased, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property." This detail complicated the situation. The relative understood that by taking Ruth as his wife, he would be committing not only to caring for her and Naomi, but also to ensuring that Elimelech's inheritance would pass on to Ruth's descendants, not his own. This meant that any investment he made in the land and the family would not directly benefit his own lineage. Understanding the implications, the relative withdrew. "In that case, I cannot redeem it, for I might endanger my own estate. You redeem the land and Ruth in my place." "Cannot do it," With this declaration, the way was clear for Boaz to act as the Redeemer. To seal the agreement in a public and formal manner, as was the custom of the time, the nearest relative removed his sandal and handed it to Boaz. This gesture, though simple, was a legal way of confirming that he renounced his right and that Boaz now assumed the responsibility of redeeming the land and marrying Ruth. Boaz, holding the sandal in his hands, turned to the elders and all those present at the city gate. He proclaimed in a loud voice so that everyone could hear, "Today you are witnesses that I have acquired from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also taken Ruth, the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, as my wife, to maintain the name of the deceased with his inheritance, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. You are witnesses today." The elders and all the people present responded with one voice, blessing Boaz and Ruth. "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. And through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." With the agreement sealed, Boaz had fulfilled his word. He was now not only the legal redeemer but also Ruth's protector and husband. The love and integrity that had guided his actions were evident to all, and God was blessing every step along the way. When Ruth learned of the resolution, her heart overflowed with gratitude. God, in his infinite goodness, had provided not only a husband but also a man of character and faith who was willing to do what was right, even if it meant sacrificing his own interests. Naomi, seeing the outcome of the entire process, fully understood the depth of divine providence. She, who had once felt bitter and empty, now saw before her the restoration of her family and the continuation of Elimelech's lineage. The days following Boaz's resolution were marked by great joy in Bethlehem. The news that Boaz had redeemed Ruth and decided to marry her quickly spread throughout the city. The story of a young Moabite woman who had left her homeland, showing loyalty to her mother-in-law Naomi and dedicating herself to the God of Israel, was now transforming into a beautiful narrative of redemption and hope. Boaz, a respected and upright man, made all the necessary preparations for the wedding. There was no doubt among the people of Bethlehem about the nobility of his act, and many admired his willingness to follow God's laws and care for those under his responsibility. Ruth, in turn, prepared for the new role she would assume as Boaz's wife and as part of the community of Israel, a position she accepted with gratitude and humility. The day of the wedding arrived, and Bethlehem was filled with a spirit of celebration. The people gathered to witness the union of Boaz and Ruth, knowing that this marriage was not just the union of two people, but also a symbol of God's faithfulness in fulfilling his promises. The women of the city, who had once whispered about Naomi's bitter return, now congratulated her, seeing how God had turned her sorrow into joy. The ceremony was simple but deeply significant. Boaz, with Ruth by his side, declared before the elders and the entire community his commitment to love, protect, and care for her according to God's law. Ruth, in turn, vowed to be a faithful wife and to follow the path of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all her heart. After the wedding, Boaz took Ruth into his home, and together they began a new life, marked by love, respect, and faith. God's blessing on that union was evident, and it wasn't long before Ruth conceived a child. The birth of this child was celebrated not only by Boaz and Ruth, but by all of Bethlehem, who saw in that boy a clear sign of God's goodness and mercy. Naomi, who had once called herself Mara because of her bitterness, now held her grandson in her arms with tears of joy in her eyes. The women of the city came to her, saying, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a redeemer. May his name be famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Naomi, now restored and full, looked at the boy with a heart full of gratitude. She named the boy Obed, which means servant, for he would be a servant of God, a link in the great chain of the redemption story that God was writing. Obed grew up in Bethlehem, in a family marked by faith and fidelity to God. He was raised with the values of his parents, learning from an early age about the love and loyalty that had united Boaz and Ruth, and about the divine providence that had guided their lives. When Obed became a man, he married and had a son named Jesse, who, in turn, became the father of David, the great king of Israel. The lineage of Obed, which began with the union of Boaz and Ruth, was not just a succession of names. It was the fulfillment of God's promises. From David, many years later, would come Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world, who would bring redemption not just to Israel but to all humanity. Thus, the story of Ruth and Boaz, marked by acts of faith, love, and obedience, became part of the greatest story of all, the story of salvation that God had been preparing since the foundation of the world. The marriage of Ruth and Boaz not only brought joy and redemption to their own lives but also established the royal lineage from which the Messiah would come, fulfilling prophecies and demonstrating that, in all things, God is in control, guiding the steps of those who trust in Him. And so, the story that began with sorrow and loss in Moab found its climax in joy and redemption in Bethlehem, showing that God can transform any situation, no matter how difficult it may seem, into a work of His grace and eternal love. The story of Ruth is a powerful testimony of faithfulness, loyalty, and love that transcends cultural and religious barriers. It shows us how God can transform difficult and painful circumstances into a glorious future, not just for individuals but for all humanity. Ruth's journey from a Moabite widow to one of the matriarchs of Israel is an inspiration for us all, teaching us to trust in God and be loyal to our families and the purpose He has for our lives. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more inspiring content like this, and share in the comments. What impacted you most about Ruth's life? We are eager to hear from you. See you in the next video.